In 1991, a retired fisherman in Bonavista, Newfoundland lived on less than $14 a week for groceries. He made the same pot of soup every Sunday night and ate from it until Thursday. His daughter said he never complained once. That soup is number 3 on this list. He learned it from his mother during the war. Number 21 cost less than $2. Number 11 was invented by a prairie widow who had not left her farmhouse in 6 weeks. These 25 meals were designed for one thing: survival. They fed people eating alone at kitchen tables that used to seat 6. People stretching a pension check across 30 days and hoping the math held. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 25 forgotten poor man one-pot meals for Canadian seniors living alone. Number 25, bread and tomato soup. This was the meal that said, I have almost nothing left in the cupboard, and I'm still going to eat tonight. A senior with half a loaf of stale bread and a tin of tomatoes could make a supper that filled the kitchen with warmth. You tore the bread into rough pieces and dropped them into a pot with crushed tomatoes, a clove of garlic, and enough water to loosen it. 15 minutes of simmering, and the bread dissolved into a thick porridge that stuck to your ribs and cost almost nothing. A pinch of salt, a bit of whatever oil you had, that was the whole thing. Italian families who settled in Hamilton and Toronto in the 1940s brought this with them from the old country. They called it by different names depending on which village they came from, but the recipe never changed. Stale bread, tomatoes, heat. Seniors who remembered it made it on nights when the cupboard was bare and the will to cook was even barer. Modern restaurants in Montreal now serve a version for $16 a bowl and call it rustic. Your Nona called it Tuesday. Number 24. Potato and onion soup. If you grew up in Cape Breton or anywhere in the Maritimes where the pay was short and the winters were long, you knew this meal before you knew how to read. 2 potatoes, 1 onion, a knob of butter, or a spoonful of bacon dripping, water, and salt. You sliced the potatoes thin, diced the onion, dropped everything into a pot, and let it simmer until the potatoes fell apart and thickened the broth into something creamy without a drop of cream. The bacon fat gave it a ghost of smokiness that made it taste richer than it had any right to be. For a senior living alone on old age security, this was a Wednesday night miracle. Potatoes cost pennies. Onions kept for weeks in a paper bag under the counter. The whole thing could be made sitting on a kitchen chair without lifting anything heavier than a wooden spoon. Women from church parishes in Glace Bay still bring this to shut-ins. They carry it in mason jars, and it reheats the next day like it was made fresh. Number 23. Ham bone and split pea soup. Nothing went to waste in a household that understood hunger. When the ham was eaten down to the bone became the next 4 meals. A senior would drop it into a pot with dried yellow split peas soaked overnight, an onion, a carrot, and enough water to cover everything by 2 inches. It simmered for 3 or 4 hours until the peas dissolved into a thick green porridge and the broth pulled every trace of smoky sweetness from the bone. By the end, the soup was dense enough to hold a spoon upright. A bag of split peas cost 69 cents in 1988 and fed a person for most of a week. The ham bone was free, already paid for by Sunday dinner. This was arithmetic. In Quebec, they called it soupe aux pois, and it had been keeping families alive since the fur trade. The habitants made it with salt pork instead of ham, and it was served in every cafe, every lumber camp, and every farmhouse kitchen in the province for 200 years. Seniors who made this were not following a recipe. They were following a memory that ran deeper than language. Number 22. Cabbage and sausage pot. 1 head of cabbage, 2 or 3 smoked sausage links, a pot of water. That was the entire shopping list. You quartered the cabbage, Slice the sausage into thick coins and let them simmer together for 45 minutes until the cabbage turned silky and sweet and the sausage filled the broth with garlic and smoke. A head of cabbage cost less than $1 and could feed a person for 3 days. Smoked sausage kept in the refrigerator for weeks without turning. For a senior with arthritis in their hands, there was almost no knife work. You could tear the cabbage apart with your fingers. You could snap the sausage links by hand. This meal required no grip strength, no precision, and almost no money. Ukrainian grandmothers on the prairies made this every week with kielbasa from the local butcher. Polish families in Winnipeg made it every winter. German families in Kitchener made it when the snow piled past the windows. It crossed every language and every background because poverty does not care where your people came from. Number 21. Rice and canned salmon stew. When you could not get to the store and the roads were buried in snow, this is what you made. A tin of salmon, a cup of rice, a tin of cream of mushroom soup, and enough water to thin it. Everything went into one pot. 20 minutes later, you had something warm, creamy, and filling. The canned salmon was already cooked, so there was no handling raw fish with unsteady hands. No worrying about temperature or freshness, just open, pour, stir, and wait. During the 1970s and the 1980s, this became the unofficial meal of seniors in rural Saskatchewan and northern Ontario. People who lived 40 minutes from the nearest grocery store and kept their pantries stocked like a bunker. It was not pretty, it was not something you would photograph, but it kept people fed and independent when the alternative was going hungry or giving up and moving to town. Number 20. Chili with kidney beans. Not the competition kind with hand-cut brisket and dried chilies from a specialty shop. The poor man kind. A pound of ground beef browned in a pot, a can of red kidney beans, a can of tomatoes, chili powder and salt. That was the whole recipe. 30 minutes and you had a pot that lasted 3 days. And it tasted better on the second day than the first. For a senior cooking alone, this was the ultimate batch meal. Make it Sunday night, eat it Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. The beans made it filling. The tomatoes made it bright. And the beef, even the cheapest tube from the discount bin, gave it substance. Food banks in Edmonton and Saskatoon packed the ingredients for this into hampers because they knew exactly who was going to make it and exactly how far it would stretch. Number 19. Egg drop soup. A pot of boiling water or chicken broth. 1 EGG. A splash of soy sauce. A handful of whatever green you had, maybe a few leaves of spinach, maybe some frozen peas. You brought the liquid to a rolling boil, then slowly poured in a beaten egg while stirring in one direction. The egg turned into golden ribbons that floated through the broth like silk. Total cost, maybe 30 cents if you used water and an egg from the carton. Maybe 75 cents with broth. It was ready in 4 minutes. For a senior who was too tired to stand, too sad to cook, or too broke to care, this was the meal that said you still have to eat something tonight. Chinese Canadian families taught this to their neighbors in Vancouver and Calgary and Winnipeg. It crossed kitchen walls the way food always does, through kindness and proximity. A woman who could barely hold a pot could still crack an egg and feed herself something warm. Number 18. Lentil soup. A bag of red or green lentils, an onion, a carrot, salt, water. Nothing else was needed, but if you had a potato, you threw that in too. Lentils did not need soaking. You rinsed them, dumped everything into a pot, and simmered for 30 minutes. They fell apart on their own, turning the broth thick and earthy without any help. A bag of lentils cost $1.20 in 1990 and made 6 or 7 bowls of soup. For a senior with no teeth, this was a godsend. Lentil soup required no chewing at all. It was soft, warm, and dissolved on the tongue. Indian families in Brampton and Surrey had been making versions of this for generations. They called it dal and seasoned it with turmeric, cumin, and whatever spices they had. When the smell of it drifted into the hallways of apartment buildings, other seniors knocked on doors to ask what was cooking. That is how recipes travel, not through books, through walls. First pattern break. Here is where things get personal. The meals on this list are not just recipes, they are survival strategies invented by people who had no one cooking for them. A senior living alone in this country faces something no cooking show ever talks about. The loneliness of making food for one. The silence of a kitchen that used to be full. The quiet grief of cutting a recipe in half because the person you used to share it with is gone. These one-pot meals solved more than hunger. They solved the problem of effort. When you are grieving, when you are tired, when your hands ache and your back will not straighten, the distance between the couch and the stove feels like a mile. A one-pot meal shortens that distance. One burner, one pot, one spoon. You can do that. You can always do that. Number 17, barley and beef soup. A handful of pearl barley, a beef bone or a couple of cheap stewing cubes, an onion, a carrot, a potato, salt, and water. You let it simmer on the back of the stove for 2 hours, and the barley swelled up and thickened the broth into something that filled you and held you. In the small towns of Ontario and Manitoba, this was the soup that appeared on every church supper table from October to April. It was the soup that neighbors brought when someone lost a husband. It was the soup you could leave simmering all afternoon while you napped in the chair, and it would only get better. For a senior whose appetite had shrunk to almost nothing, the barley gave the broth enough body that even a small bowl felt like a full meal. Number 16. Kraft. Dinner with cut-up hot dogs. This is the one that everyone remembers but nobody admits to. A box of Kraft dinner cost 39 cents in 1985. A package of hot dogs cost $1.19. You boiled the noodles, stirred in the powder, the butter, the milk, and dropped in sliced hot dogs. The entire meal cost less than $1 and fed a person twice. It was not a meal anyone was proud of. It was a meal that kept you alive when pride was a luxury you could not afford. Seniors who had raised 5 children on a mill worker's salary in Thunder Bay or a fisherman's wage in Lunenburg did not look down on this meal. They understood it. Sometimes dinner is not about nutrition or tradition. Sometimes it is about not going to bed hungry. Canada eats more Kraft dinner per person than any country on earth. That is not a point of pride. It is a measure of how many people in this country have had to feed themselves on almost nothing. Number 15. Turnip and potato mash stew. In Newfoundland, they simply called it a boil-up. Turnip, potato, maybe a bit of salt beef or salt pork if you had it, all in one pot of water. You boiled it until everything was soft enough to mash with a fork right in the pot. The turnip gave it sweetness. The potato gave it body. The salt meat gave it enough flavor to make you forget how simple it was. This was the meal that outport seniors made 3 or 4 nights a week when the pension ran thin and the ferry had not come with fresh supplies. It required no recipe, no measuring, no timing. You put things in the pot and waited. A senior on the Northern Peninsula could make this for less than $1 and eat from it for 2 days. The leftovers mashed down further and became a thick paste you spread on bread the next morning. Number 14, macaroni with canned tomatoes and onion, a box of elbow macaroni, a large can of whole tomatoes, an onion if you had one, salt and pepper. You boiled the macaroni, drained it, and poured in the tomatoes, breaking them apart with a spoon The juice from the can became the sauce. Some people added a pinch of sugar to cut the acidity. Some stirred in a slice of processed cheese to melt through it. In the 1960s and 70s, this was a standard supper in working-class kitchens from Sydney, Nova Scotia to Prince George, British Columbia. For a senior cooking alone, a single batch lasted 3 meals. The tomato acid kept it from spoiling quickly. The pasta held its shape when reheated. It was the kind of meal that tasted like Thursday night in a kitchen where nobody had the energy to try harder, and nobody needed to. Second pattern break. Here is something the grocery industry does not want you to think about. These meals cost almost nothing because they use ingredients that cannot be marked up. Dried beans, potatoes, onions, rice, cabbage, canned tomatoes. There is no brand loyalty in a bag of lentils. There is no advertising budget behind a head of cabbage. The profit margin on a tin of kidney beans is pennies. That is why you never see commercials for these meals. That is why no celebrity chef builds a cookbook around potato and onion soup. The foods that keep seniors alive and independent are the foods nobody can make money from. Instead, they sell frozen dinners at $5 each that contain less nutrition than a bowl of pea soup that costs 40 cents. The economics of it are not complicated. They are just cruel. Number 13. Chicken and dumplings. Chicken backs and necks cost almost nothing at the butcher. A senior could buy a couple of dollars worth of bony parts, simmer them in water with celery and onion until the meat fell off, pull the bones out, and drop spoonfuls of biscuit dough into the broth. The dumplings puffed up soft and pillowy, absorbing the chicken flavor as they cooked. 20 minutes with the lid on and the pot was full of tender chicken, thick broth, and dumplings that dissolved on the tongue. This was the meal that maritime grandmothers made when someone was grieving or sick, or had just come home from the hospital. They brought it in covered pots and left it on the doorstep without knocking. For a senior cooking alone, a single batch lasted nearly a week. And every time you reheated a bowl, the kitchen smelled like somebody still cared enough to cook for you. Number 12. Newfoundland fish and brewis. Salt cod soaked overnight and hard bread soaked alongside it. The next morning, you boiled them separately until tender, then mixed them together in the pot. The final step was the scrunchions. Small cubes of salt pork fat fried until crisp and golden, poured over the whole thing with their rendered fat still sizzling. For 400 years, Newfoundland families survived on this meal because salt cod and hardtack were the two things that never spoiled and never ran out. A senior in an outport community could make this from pantry staples that had been sitting on the shelf for months. It required patience, not skill. Time, not money. The cod was $1. The hard bread was 50 cents. The scrunchions were a luxury that turned survival into something approaching pleasure. Newfoundlanders who left the island and settled in Fort McMurray or Toronto still make this on Sunday mornings. It is the taste of home for people who cannot go back. Number 11. Prairie bean and barley pot. A cup of dried navy beans soaked overnight. A handful of barley, an onion, a carrot, salt, pepper, and water. You put everything in a pot in the morning and let it simmer on the lowest heat until supper time. The beans turned creamy, the barley swelled and thickened the broth, the onion dissolved into nothing and left only sweetness behind. On the prairies during the 1930s, this was not a recipe. It was a lifeline. Farm wives in Saskatchewan made this with whatever they could find after the crops failed and the dust buried the garden. Some years there was no meat at all. A widow living alone on a quarter section outside Moose Jaw survived 3 winters on this pot and nothing else. She told her granddaughter that the trick was to never let the pot go cold. You kept it on the stove, added water each morning, and ate from it each night. The pot was never empty because you never let it be. Number 10. Cabbage roll soup. This was the cheat. Making proper cabbage rolls took hours and strong hands and patience that most seniors living alone did not have. So they made the soup instead. Ground beef browned in the pot, chopped cabbage, a tin of tomatoes, rice, onion. Everything a cabbage roll contains, but in liquid form. 30 minutes and you had a pot that tasted like Christmas Eve in a Ukrainian kitchen on the prairies. For families in Vegreville, Dauphin, and Kenora, cabbage rolls were sacred, the meal that grandmothers made for holidays and funerals. But the soup version was the weeknight mercy. The version that let an 80-year-old woman with swollen knuckles still taste what her mother made without the hours of rolling and tucking. It was not the same, but it was close enough to remember. Number 9. Canned corned beef stew. A tin of corned beef, 2 potatoes, an onion, a carrot, and some water. You broke the corned beef apart with a fork, cubed the vegetables, and simmered everything for 30 minutes. The corned beef dissolved into the broth and gave it a salty, meaty richness that made the potatoes taste better than they had any right to. During the Second World War, corned beef was a staple of military rations across the country. After the war, it stayed in the pantries of people who had learned to keep non-perishable protein within reach at all times. A senior who kept 3 tins of corned beef on the shelf would never go hungry, even if the power went out and the roads closed. This was siege food dressed up as supper. Number 8. Tomato rice soup, a tin of tomatoes, a cup of rice, an onion, salt, water. Everything in one pot, simmered for 20 minutes until the rice was soft and the tomatoes had broken down into a thick, tangy broth. Some people added a spoonful of butter at the end. Some stirred in a bit of sugar. In small-town diners across Ontario and the Maritimes, this was the soup of the day every Wednesday for 50 years. Hospitals served it. School cafeterias served it. Senior centers in Moncton and Sudbury and Brandon served it because it cost almost nothing to make in volume and nobody ever sent it back. For a senior at home, a single pot lasted 2 days and reheated perfectly. The rice absorbed more liquid overnight and turned it from soup into something closer to a porridge. That was not a flaw. That was breakfast. Number 7. Baked bean pot, a tin of beans and tomato sauce, a few slices of salt pork, or a couple of strips of bacon cut into pieces, a spoonful of molasses, a squirt of mustard. Into a pot, simmered low for 20 minutes. That was the maritime version that had been feeding people from Yarmouth to Moncton for 150 years. The molasses was the secret. It turned cheap tinned beans into something dark, sweet, and smoky that tasted like it had been in a bean crock since dawn. In New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, baked beans and brown bread was Saturday night supper. It was not a tradition anyone chose. It was a tradition that poverty created and habit preserved. A senior who kept beans and molasses in the cupboard could make a meal that their great-grandmother would have recognized. That is continuity. That is proof that some things survive. Number 6. Habitant pea soup with bread. This is the meal that built Quebec. Split yellow peas, salt pork, onion, and water simmered until the peas dissolved and the pork fell apart. It had been the backbone of every lumber camp, every farmhouse, and every working-class kitchen in the province since before Confederation. A senior living alone in Trois-Rivières or Chicoutimi could make a pot for less than $2 and eat from it for 4 days. The salt pork gave it depth. The peas gave it body. A thick slice of bread, torn off the loaf and dipped into the bowl, gave it the feeling of a meal that mattered. During Sugar Shack season, they poured maple syrup over the whole thing and called it spring. But the rest of the year it was just supper. Quiet, filling, and enough. Number 5. Jig's dinner in a pot. This is Newfoundland's national meal. Salt beef, soaked overnight to pull the brine out, then boiled in a pot with cabbage, turnip, potato, carrot, and a pudding bag full of split yellow peas. The whole thing simmered for hours, and by the time it was done, the kitchen smelled the way Sundays were supposed to smell. The vegetables softened in the salt beef broth until they were tender enough to cut with a spoon. The peas pudding came out of the bag dense and golden, and you sliced it and ate it alongside the meat and the vegetables with a bit of mustard. For Newfoundland seniors, this was more than food. It was the week's anchor. Sunday was Jig's dinner. Monday was hash made from the leftovers. There was no question about what to cook and no decision to make. The tradition decided for you, and for someone living alone, that certainty was a mercy. Third pattern break. Here's what nobody says out loud. Half the seniors in this country who live alone skip meals. Not because they forgot, not because they are not hungry, because cooking for one feels pointless. The table is too quiet, the portion is too small, the effort does not feel worth it when there is nobody across the table to share it with. These one-pot meals were the answer to that silence, not because they were exciting, but because they were possible. You could make them tired, you could make them grieving, you could make them with hands that shook and eyes that could not read the small print on a recipe card. They did not ask much of you. They only asked that you stand at the stove long enough to feed yourself, and that was enough. Number 4. Depression stew. This was the meal with no name. Every family had a version, and no two were the same. Whatever you had went into the pot. A potato, a carrot, half an onion, a handful of barley or rice or pasta, a bit of leftover meat if there was any, a bone if there was not. Water, salt, and thyme. During the 1930s, when the prairies turned to dust and 2/3 of Saskatchewan was on government relief, this was supper every night in thousands of farmhouse kitchens. The women who made it did not call it a recipe. They called it making do. A retired grain farmer outside Regina ate this stew 3 nights a week for 11 years after his wife passed. His daughter found the pot still on the stove the day he died at 93. The stew kept him alive. The routine of making it kept him moving. And the taste of it, different every time but always the same in the way it warmed him, kept him connected to every meal his mother had ever made from nothing. Number 3. Chicken soup. A whole chicken in a pot of water with carrots, celery, onion, and salt. It simmered for 2 hours until the house smelled like someone's grandmother still lived there. The broth turned golden. The chicken fell apart. The vegetables softened into the most basic, most nourishing, most healing meal human beings have ever invented. Every culture has a version. Every generation passes it down. For a senior living alone, a pot of chicken soup was more than nutrition. It was a connection to every person who had ever made it for them, every sick day, every cold January, every heartbreak. It was the taste of being taken care of. When you make it for yourself alone in a quiet kitchen with no one to share it with, it still works. The steam still rises, the broth still warms, and somewhere in the smell of it, you remember that you are worth the trouble of cooking. Number 2, tourtière stew. This is the cheat version of the pie that every French-Canadian family argues about at Christmas. The real tourtière takes hours. The pastry has to be just right. The spicing has to match what your grandmother did, not what the cookbook says. But a senior living alone could take the filling. The ground pork seasoned with cinnamon, clove and allspice, the diced potatoes, the onion, and put it all in a pot with enough broth to make it a stew. No pastry, no rolling pin, no oven, just a pot on the stove and 25 minutes. It tasted like Christmas Eve in a kitchen in Lac Saint Jean without any of the work. The spices were the same. The smell was the same. You closed your eyes and you were 10 years old, and your grandmère was still at the stove, and the house was full of people who are gone now, and for a few minutes while the pot simmered, none of that mattered. Number 1, beans and toast, a tin of beans, a slice of bread, a pot barely bigger than a coffee mug. You heated the beans, toasted the bread, poured one on top of the other, and ate it standing at the counter or sitting in the chair by the window. This was the meal that did not pretend to be anything. It was the last resort, the one you made when the fridge was empty and the energy was gone, and the only thing standing between you and not eating was a tin opener and 2 minutes of effort. Seniors across this country, in every province, in apartments and farmhouses and bungalows with the heat turned down to save money, have eaten this meal more times than they will ever tell you. It costs 60 cents. It takes 90 seconds. It keeps you alive. And sometimes, when you are 82 and alone, and the winter dark comes at 4 in the afternoon, keeping alive is the whole victory. Nobody will ever write a love letter to beans and toast. But it has saved more Canadian seniors from hunger than any government program ever designed. Here is my challenge. Make one of these this week. The potato soup, the lentil stew, the chicken and rice. Then sit down at the table, not the couch. Set a place. Eat it slow. Because these meals were never just about being cheap. They were about staying alive and staying human when the world made it easy to stop trying. Share which one you are going to make in the comments. I want to know if the pea soup gets more love than the Jig's dinner. I want to know if anyone else's grandmother kept a pot on the back of the stove that was never allowed to go empty. Because these are not just recipes. They are proof that the simplest food made in one pot, eaten alone, can still be an act of dignity.